Nat Keohane, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate your time. And certainly there's a lot going on right now. But before we dive into some of these issues, could you just tell us how did you get started at C2ES?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it. So I'm an economist by training. I've spent a little bit of time before I got into the kind of advocacy world as an academic economist. I was a professor at the School of Management at Yale and was getting sort of fed up with the slow pace of academia. I wanted to be in policy. This was about 18 years ago now. And so at that point, I left, jumped off the tenure track. After I got promoted, I left and I joined Environmental Defense Fund where I spent a lot of time. So I spent a little bit of time in the Obama administration as well in 2011, 2012, then went back to EDF. But I mention that because I kind of learned what it was like to be an advocate and a climate advocate and a climate expert at EDF. And a lot of the things I learned there, really a focus on market-based approaches, a focus on pragmatism and so on. There's only a handful of organizations that are like that. And one of the others is C2ES. And so when the opening came at C2ES to run a climate organization, I decided like that's what I really wanted to do. I've been running a climate program at a big environmental organization. I wanted to see what it was like to run my own organization, move even further away from the kind of background I had as being an academic and an expert into thinking about what it was like to build an organizational culture and to build an organization and see it grow. And so I came here 4.5 years ago, and it's been a lot of fun.
So I imagine a lot has changed in 4.5 years, especially in the last, I don't know, 10 months or so. Could you speak to maybe how that work has changed, if at all, over the last, I don't know, 12 months or so?
Yeah, sure. The world is definitely changing as we speak. I might start with the things that haven't changed, the things that sort of we remain core to. I mean, our North Star around finding solutions on climate and energy challenges remains. The how of how we work remains the same. We convene businesses and talk with them, learn from them, and mobilize their voices for advocacy. We convene negotiators and policymakers at all levels of government. So we continue to be a group that is totally focused on solutions, that is willing to talk to pretty much anybody on both sides of the aisle in Washington, willing to talk to folks at the international, local levels from a wide range of backgrounds. But the what of what we're focusing on obviously has changed, and it always does change with the context. So a year ago, right at this time, and a year and a half ago, we were working on the design of the clean energy tax credits that had been passed under the Inflation Reduction Act in the Congress in the US. We were part of the push to get those clean energy and manufacturing tax credits passed back in 2022. This year, we've been focused on defending them. And I think we were one of a handful of groups that managed successfully, in part, to make the case for many of those clean energy tax credits. One of the sort of overlooked stories, I would argue, of this year is that while some of the headline tax credits for wind and electric vehicles and even solar were taken away, and that's a real blow in terms of emissions, a lot of the tax credits were preserved. Tax credits for other carbon-free energy, battery storage, advanced manufacturing, carbon capture, clean hydrogen. A lot of those credits were preserved, and that was really, I think, due to the efforts of C2S and other groups to make that economic case. A year ago, we were, and several years back, we've been focused in the international world on the Paris Agreement and on getting the Paris Agreement up to snuff and sort of getting all the guidance and the rule book in place. Now we're really focused on how to make sure that it's also fit for purpose in a world in which we don't need to just set more and more targets, but countries need to realize those targets. They need to implement policies. How can we help the Paris Agreement shift from just a negotiating room to something that's focused on implementation? And then we work a lot with companies. In the past few years, there's been much more focus on headline targets and setting targets and so on. Now we're working with those same companies to figure out how do we help give them the tools to meet the targets that they've already set. And so that North Star remains the same, but some of the what of what we do has changed. I will say the last big thing that we see is, energy has become much more of something on the front burner for everybody in a way that it wasn't a year or two ago, as we see the rise of AI data centers and industrial manufacturing and so on. And that presents us with a lot of openings and opportunities.
Well, let's talk about trends then for a second. You talk about kind of the ubiquity of the conversation around electricity prices for households, for businesses. Certainly, the AI data center conversation is happening quite a bit. What are the trends that you're seeing, and how is that affecting the climate conversation?
So I think the biggest thing is that the tangible economic opportunities and economic benefits at the local level, the tangible benefits from clean energy, from the low carbon transition are becoming real to people in a way they haven't been before. And that's the result of a whole bunch of things. That's the result of falling costs of wind and solar. That's the result of new technologies, new battery storage technologies, and so on. We see factories coming up in West Virginia and Georgia and throughout the country. But I think that's kind of an under recognized trend that we're starting to see that I think is going to have really profound implications. So when I started working on climate as seriously, when I left academia 15, 17 years ago, 18 years ago, I was working back on the Waxman-Markey cap and trade legislation for folks who've been around for a while. At that point, this was all hypothetical. The whole clean energy economy was all that lay in the future. And those of us who are arguing for climate policy and clean energy policy, we're talking about technologies that hadn't been realized yet. And now we're talking about factories that are already in place. We're talking about jobs. We're talking about investment. Not enough yet, right? We don't have enough of that yet, but we have the examples on the ground that provide those tangible benefits. And I think that is going to make a huge difference to local politics, to national politics, and globally to this conversation going forward. And it creates a huge tailwind, I think, for those of us working on these issues.
One of the challenges we've seen in this energy transition is that last step of deployment and getting on the grid and the infrastructure. So let's talk about permitting reform. It's an ongoing conversation on Capitol Hill. There's moments of optimism and moments of pessimism. Governors recently weighed in from both parties, pushing. There's business groups weighing in. What's your view on permitting reform? What has to happen for this Congress to get something done? And what are the things that maybe each side might have to begrudgingly accept in order to get a deal?
So, first of all, absolutely. We are totally focused on permitting reform right now at the federal level. We sort of pick a policy campaign one at a time that we can work on where we think we can make a difference, move the needle, and where the business voices in our network and our broader coalition can make a difference. And I think right now that is permitting. It's in line also with the trends I just talked about, because if we're going to take advantage of those tangible economic benefits that we're seeing for the first time, as you said, we have to build more stuff. We have to build energy infrastructure. We have to make it possible to build clean energy facilities and manufacturing and factories and so on. And so permitting is a major focus of ours. Now, in terms of the prospects for getting legislation passed, on the one hand, it's never easy to pass anything in Congress. That sort of goes without saying. We're having this conversation during what is now, I think, the second longest government shutdown. And so all of that is just weighing against us. We need to be realistic about the prospects. And at the same time, we do see a deal space in Congress to pass major permitting reform at the federal level because of some of those trends we've talked about as well. So that AI boom and the data center boom is making Republicans much more interested in building new transmission and getting new electrons onto the grid than just a few years ago, when building new transmission seemed to be kind of a Democratic coded thing that was just about new wind and solar. And so that on the one hand has moved the Republicans to say, okay, well, we can talk about transmission. Let's think about how to solve that problem. And on the other side of the aisle, you have a Democratic Party that I think has realized it needs to be pro building stuff. And you have Democrats who are saying we need to be building more energy infrastructure. We can't wait 7 or 10 years to build a transmission line or a manufacturing facility or whatever it is. We need to be making it easier to build, not harder. And so I think the Democratic side is coming to thinking seriously about what kind of reforms can be made on the permitting side, even on the National Economic Policy Act, on NEPA, to make it easier to build and to permit things. And you put those two things together, you've got a deal space, I think, where Congress could agree. I will tell you the biggest obstacle right now is just trust. It's trust that if they implement a kind of level playing field agreement in Congress that is really technology neutral, just makes it easier to build and let the kind of cheapest, fastest energy win, which as a climate hawk, I am confident that's going to be clean energy. But if Congress passes that kind of level playing field legislation, right now there's not the trust that that will be implemented faithfully by the administration. And so that's where a lot of the conversation is. If we can fix that obstacle, if we can overcome that hurdle, I think we could see a deal in Congress, in this Congress.
You're in regular touch with leaders across corporate America. In this political environment, what are you hearing from them about their climate and sustainability goals and aspirations?
So the most important thing that we hear from our businesses is that they are staying the course on the commitments they've made. So we've got 42 Fortune 500 companies in our business council. We've got another 150 or so companies that we work with in some way or another on technology or on climate resilience or on local economic policy and local economic growth. And we hear again and again that they are remaining true to their targets. Nobody wants to make a big headline right now. Nobody wants to make a big splash. That's not just on climate, by the way. That I think is across the board. So this is not going to be a new time for a time for new targets, for setting new ambition. But I think from a climate point of view, that's okay because we just went through a few years where all of these companies made really ambitious targets, net zero targets, emissions reduction targets, clean energy targets of some sort. Now they are saying, help us meet those targets. Help us implement the policies and implement the investments, make the investments, work with our suppliers, work across our supply chains in order to achieve the things we've said we're going to do. And by the way, they said they were going to do them not because they were caving to some sort of public pressure. When we talk to companies and we say, why are you doing this? They say, look, there is a business case for this. Either it's because they know that their company is going to be around in 10 or 20 or 30 years and they want to be competitive and leading their sector at that time, or maybe they're making investments that are going to in factories that are going to last 20 or 30 years, and they know those factories need to be paying out even in a very different kind of net zero world. It's also because they need to attract talent, and we hear from every company we speak with that to get the talent they need in this next generation, they need to show up on climate. So those motivations are still there. We're not hearing any backsliding. What we are hearing is we've set the targets. We're not going to revise those for now, but help us make some progress over the next few years.
This is a theme, I think, going into COP, and I know you're heading down to Brazil later this month, really just not maybe a week or two from now. But what are you expecting to hear when you're at COP, and what's your message to global leaders when you're there about the U.S. leadership in the world on climate?
Yeah, so I'll divide those into the two things because the message on the U.S. and then what do we expect to see are sort of related but distinct. I think on the U.S. side, we will point to the kind of messages I just talked about, that companies remain committed even if they're sort of head down and doing the work. You've got state leadership all across the country. Obviously, you've got local leadership. So you've got actors other than the federal government who are really committed and making progress on climate and clean energy. And to go back to what I said earlier on, you've got this overall trend of the local economic benefits of clean energy and low carbon transition showing up. And I think that's going to help improve the politics over time. With respect to the COP and kind of the international dynamics, we think that this COP is an important inflection point. Now, everybody says every time, oh my gosh, this is the most important COP. And this is not going to be a conference that has major headlines coming out of the negotiations. There are things the negotiators will be working on, but that's not going to be the headline. The real question is, can the Paris Agreement and this conference, the UN Framework Convention on Climate, can we shift that from what has been now really 20 years almost of negotiations to a focus on how to drive emissions down through more effective international cooperation? And that means using the provisions of the Paris Agreement to look at how are we doing globally against the trajectory we need? What are the areas where greater international cooperation can make a difference? How do we catalyze that? A few years ago, there was something called the Global Stocktake, which really tried to step back and take that big picture. That happens every 5 years under the Paris Agreement. So what we're asking is, how do we take those provisions of Paris and really lean into them so that the focus of these conversations and of these conferences becomes action and becomes how we can have more effective cooperation among countries? Because we will not solve our climate and energy challenges just inside individual capitals or individual countries. we need effective international cooperation. And that's what the Paris Agreement, I think, can deliver.
What's the biggest professional risk you've ever taken?
So that one's easy for me. The biggest professional risk I took was leaving a tenure track job in academia. I had just been promoted to associate professor at Yale. Everybody I knew at that time thought I was crazy for willingly kind of stepping off that tenure track and diving into policy. And I had a lot of friends who stayed in academia and helped actually transform academic economics for the better. I was getting frustrated with economics as a discipline, not because I don't believe that it has powerful tools, but because the academic pecking order was driving me crazy. But that was the biggest risk I ever took, and I actually never looked back. I was pretty confident. I said I don't need like the kind of 30-year sinecure of getting tenure. I'm pretty sure that if I can be an effective climate expert and advocate and think about and advocate for good policies, I'll land on my feet, and I've really enjoyed it so far. But that by far, when I stepped away from academia, I had a lot of friends saying, "Wow, that's crazy. We've never heard of anyone doing that."
Yeah, for sure. And finally, Nat, what's something about you that might surprise people?
Well, I don't know if this is surprising, maybe, who knows? But once upon a time, I was a pretty competitive athlete. Now I'm a dad and, run an organization and so on. But I used to be a competitive rower. I still get out in a single now and then. But I rowed internationally at not quite at the very top level, but at the next to top level. I held a course record at the head of the Charles for 20 years. It was set on a beautiful, perfect day with perfect conditions. But I held the club single record in the head of the Charles for 20 years and rode in the championship single a few years. This was all back in my 20s. So now I go out a little bit in my single, and but I don't have any confusion about when the glory days were. But that's something that if you met me now, you might not know that was buried in my past.
Very cool. Well, we'll leave it there. Nat Keohane, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. It's been a fun conversation.